For those of you who know NBR's Strategic Asia series, you'll realize that one of the trends we've really tried to understand over the last 2 decades are changes in the relative balance of power in the Asia-Pacific and the strategic implications of those changes. And that was one of the questions that we asked our contributors this year to focus on. And one specific trend in particular, which has become very clear, and that is the fact that 30 years after the end of the Cold War, the US-China competition is now a defining characteristic of international relations within this region and in fact worldwide. That fact is causing policymakers and capitals around the region to ponder their choices and make decisions. But that was one of the clearest trends that we asked our authors to look at this year. There are 2 others that are slightly less clear, partly because they're still unfolding. And so the second trend is obviously the COVID-19 pandemic, which is still in full force, was unfolding as we began our research planning for this volume a year or so ago. And the effects of that will be manifold and they will be long lasting. In the short term, we obviously have public health crises in societies around the world. We have impacts on economic growth and policy decisions as governments are grappling to figure out how to deal with this challenge. But as we look ahead into the medium term, the pandemic and the way that countries will recover from it, the policy choices they make today that will impact their economic growth rates over the next 5 to 10 years, and the impacts that those choices will then have on their ability to generate national power in 2030 and 2040 is a second of the 3 trends that we asked our authors to think about this year. The third trend is also not quite clear, and that's what we've been calling a growing pushback against globalization. And we've seen manifestations of this in different parts of the world since the 2008-2009 financial crisis. It's led to populist governments rising in a number of countries. It's led to debates within societies about the extent to which a globalized, liberalized economic system is the most appropriate way forward. And we're seeing it now during the pandemic in a supply chain crisis that's really affecting economic growth and affecting business decisions of major companies worldwide. And so this pushback against globalization and those policy debates and political debates that are taking place within countries across the region were the third trend that we asked our authors to think about. The answers to those are not clear, but we will hear from several of our contributors this year in the second half of our program today in a panel discussion that my colleague and co-editor Alison Szalwinski will moderate. Before then, I'm going to turn the platform back to NBR's president, Roy Kamphausen, who will introduce our keynote speaker today. So, Roy, over to you.
Thanks so much, Michael. It's a pleasure to join you in welcoming our audience, including participants from around the world. But I should note a special thanks to Michael, who has been a part of Strategic Asia for all of its 20 years and as a co-editor for 11 of the volumes in the series. Well, I'm Roy Kamphausen. As I said, I'm delighted to join and welcome you to the launch of this year's Strategic Asia volume, Navigating Tumultuous Times in the Indo-Pacific. It's now my privilege to introduce our keynote speaker this afternoon, Laura Rosenberger. Laura Rosenberger currently serves as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for China and Taiwan on the National Security Council's staff. I believe she's calling into our program today from the White House. Ms. Rosenberger previously served as Director of the Alliance for Ensuring Securing Democracy and as a Senior Fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. For over a decade before that, she held a range of positions while at the State Department and on the NSC staff, including as Chief of Staff to then Deputy Secretary of State Antony Blinken, now Secretary of State, and as Special Assistant to then Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs Bill Burns, currently Director of the Central Intelligence Agency. Laura has an extensive background in Northeast Asian affairs, having previously served as Director for China and Korea on the NSC staff, and in a variety of other roles at the State Department focused on the Asia-Pacific. Thank you so much, Laura, for joining us today in the context of all that you have going on. We're so grateful for your service to our country, and we look forward to hearing your remarks today. Over to you, Laura.
Well, thanks so much, Roy and Michael, for the invitation to join you. I am, in fact, calling you from my office at the NSC, which is why you can't see me on screen. Sorry to be audio only here from my office, but really a privilege to be able to join you all today. And congratulations on the launch of another edition of Strategic Asia. The work that you and your colleagues have been doing, over the years at NBR on Strategic Asia and on the many other publications and reports and really great research that you guys do is so important to informing the broader discussion and debate around key issues on China and in the Indo-Pacific. And I'm really looking forward to reading this year's volume. I'm joining you today, in addition to being the launch of your latest volume of Strategic Asia, as I was putting together my remarks, was realizing that this is just one day short of the one-year anniversary of President Biden and Vice President Harris taking office, and of my own much less important beginning in this particular role here a year ago tomorrow. So I actually thought what I would do is offer some reflections on the Biden administration's approach to China over the past year and how this underpins our approach in the years to come. Our approach is based on the analysis that while competition between the United States and China is particularly pronounced in the Indo-Pacific, it is, as Michael noted in his opening remarks, playing out globally as Beijing openly pursues an order that is at odds with American security, prosperity, values, and interests. And we've therefore taken a global approach to this challenge to advance our own vision for the international order. We've spent much of the first year of the administration investing in the source of U.S. strength by renewing competitiveness at home and by aligning with allies and partners abroad to compete with the PRC across the economic, technological, political, and security domains. And while doing so, we've kept lines of communication open with the PRC, including between President Biden and President Xi, in order to manage the competition. Together, we believe this approach is positioning the United States to effectively compete with the PRC to ensure that the United States and its allies and partners are writing the rules of the 21st century. So let me just outline 5 elements of the work that we've been doing over the past year, and that will be the foundation for our work going forward, starting with first investing in ourselves and really strengthening our own competitive hand. Some of you may know that I'm a football fan, and as my Steelers reminded us again this weekend, you can't win a competition with defense alone. You need to bring your best offensive game to the field. And in the competition with China, that means that the United States really needs to start with strengthening ourselves. And that's why this administration has made unprecedented domestic investments to recover from the pandemic, to head off a recession, and to build a more resilient country, and including in our democracy. The administration has driven the fastest decrease in unemployment in American history and fully vaccinated more than 200 million Americans with safe and effective vaccines. The administration successfully passed the largest infrastructure package in American history and worked to secure the nation's supply chains, ensuring that we're not dependent on any one country. And at the same time, the president, working with Congress, is taking steps to protect the United States' technological edge and our workers. A second part of strengthening our hand and investing in our sources of strength is aligning with our allies and partners who are one of our greatest sources of strength, and that's in the Indo-Pacific, and that's more broadly. And to be clear, that's not just on pushing back on China's worst abuses, that's also on advancing an affirmative vision for what the United States and our allies and partners believe the 21st century should look like and the order underpinning it. You've seen intensive diplomacy with our European partners and a converging of approaches when it comes to China. You've seen our efforts to create greater connectivity between our European and Indo-Pacific allies and partners. You've seen us elevate formats like the Quad and to harmonize approaches across a range of multilateral and minilateral institutions. Just to run through a few specifics there, we, working with the EU, have launched the Trade and Technology Council, which met for the first time in September in my hometown of Pittsburgh, where we're working with our European partners to shape technological standards and promote responsible innovation. We've worked with, again, with our European partners to resolve longstanding disputes between Airbus and Boeing, a 17-year-long dispute, so that we can ensure that we are sort of working with one another to actually deal with some of the challenges that we together face from China in the aircraft industry. And when the U.S. and EU agreed to an interim arrangement for trade in the steel and aluminum sectors, they also ensured it toughened enforcement mechanisms to prevent the sort of leakage of particularly dirty steel and aluminum from China into the markets. And again, in the Indo-Pacific, we've been working to deepen our relationships with ASEAN and to build out a number of different frameworks, including on the economic front, to ensure that we are deepening our vision for a free and open Indo-Pacific that allows countries to be able to choose their destinies. The third area is related, and that's that with our allies and partners, we are shaping the international environment around China. That's because as we engage in this competition with China, our approach is rooted in a recognition of the limited ability of the United States to change China. And so we are focused instead on shaping the strategic environment around China in a manner that represents and reflects the interests and values of the United States and our allies and partners. This requires restoring American leadership, which we've done by rejoining a number of international institutions, for instance, the World Health Organization, the Human Rights Council rejoining the Paris Climate Accord. The President's convened the world on issues like climate change at his climate summit last April, on COVID-19, which he did this past September, and on democracy with the Democracy Summit that he held in December. And of course, we're working with our allies and partners to reinforce deterrence, particularly across the Taiwan Strait and in the Indo-Pacific more broadly, again, to ensure the underpinnings of a free and open region. Fourth, we are defending our interests and our values, showing that democracy delivers and standing up for human rights. That includes holding the PRC accountable for human rights abuses, including in Xinjiang, and for its dismantling of democratic institutions in Hong Kong. We've imposed a number of costs for the PRC's action in Xinjiang through a range of different sanctions measures by working with our allies and partners in a multilateral effort by taking steps to remove products made with forced labor from our supply chains. And of course, I know that folks are familiar with our steps, our position that we are not sending diplomatic or official representation to the Olympics because of China's gross human rights abuses. We've stood in support of the people of Hong Kong in the face of the PRC's attempts to erode its autonomy and democratic institutions and processes. But we're also taking steps more broadly to ensure that sort of global norms and institutions are consistent with democratic values. That includes everything from taking steps to ensure that American investors aren't supporting China's surveillance technology firms that facilitate repression of religious and ethnic minorities within China, and protecting American sensitive data from PRC efforts to gather and exploit it. But more broadly, it also means strengthening democracy at home and abroad, and as I said earlier, and particularly as President Biden says, to show that democracy delivers. And that's really in service of making sure that it's democracies who are writing the rules of the road for trade and technology going forward, so that technologies that are going to shape our future are more rights-respecting and less subject to authoritarian control and domination. And across a range of efforts, the United States is really working to reinforce the strength of democracies to show that it is democracy that, rather than autocracy, that is the form of government best suited for the challenges of our time. And fifth, as we are undertaking all these efforts, I just want to spend a moment talking about our efforts to responsibly manage the competition with China. That includes maintaining open lines of communication, particularly at the leader level, and the development of guardrails to bound the competition and manage potential risks. We believe that these leader level engagements are particularly important to ensuring that we have effective, substantive channels of communication, and that's why the President had 2 calls with President Xi last year in a virtual meeting in November. November. And we believe it's important that we have channels with empowered PRC interlocutors on specific issues. For instance, you saw the National Security Advisor meet with Yang Jiechi in Zurich last October to that end. These engagements are really opportunities for us to set the terms for the competition and articulate principles and guardrails to ensure that competition does not veer into conflict, to be very clear about our priorities and our intentions, and to discuss areas where U.S. and PRC interests align on existential global issues like climate change and global health, and ways that we may be able to work together on those issues. On this last point, we've been really clear that working on these issues together is not a favor to us, nor should it be linked with bilateral issues. Rather, these are issues where it is the responsibility of large powers to act for the global good. There's a lot more I could cover, and of course, there's much work to be done in the years ahead, but I want to preserve some time here for questions. But I would just note, sort of in conclusion, that I believe the work we're doing is positioning the United States and our allies and partners in closer alignment to outcompete China, to protect our interests and values, ensure a free and open Indo-Pacific, and ensure that the rules of the 21st century advance our vision for the international system. So thank you again so much for having me today.
Thanks so much, Laura, for your insightful comments. We'll now transition into a short period of Q&A. Let me ask the first question, privilege of the moderator, and then we'll turn to a question from the audience. Laura, many have focused on the importance of a foreign economic policy and trade policy as a central component of a Biden administration strategy towards China and to the broader Indo-Pacific. In the fall, U.S. Trade Representative Tai and Secretary of Commerce Raimondo did a tour of Asia to consult with allies and partners, coining along the way the forthcoming American plan as an Indo-Pacific economic framework. Meanwhile, the RCEP multilateral agreement, which the U.S. is not a party to, entered into force on the 1st of this year. Can you share with us what we might expect to hear in forthcoming days about the economic framework in general, and then maybe specifically the role envisioned for Taiwan in that economic framework? Over to you.
Well, thanks so much, Roy, and I couldn't agree more about the importance of U.S. leadership in establishing the rules of the road for economic activity in the Indo-Pacific, in part so that we do not let China put U.S. workers and companies at long-term disadvantage, and in part because this is an incredibly important aspect of our efforts to ensure a free and open region. As you noted, Secretary Raimondo and Ambassador Tai have done some work on this, and of course, President Biden himself announced at the East Asia Summit our efforts to develop an Indo-Pacific economic framework with allies and partners to really deepen our economic cooperation in the region. Our initial ideas on proposed areas of economic cooperation include trade facilitation, digital economy standards, supply chain resiliency, infrastructure, decarbonization and clean energy, export controls, tax, and anti-corruption. The conversations that we've had over the previous few months with regional partners have been really important in helping to kind of crystallize our thinking, and we will continue to focus on establishing common goals and end states that we would jointly announce in the coming months, early period of 2022. We then anticipate that conversations on different pieces of this framework will move at different speeds, and I'm certainly not in a position to be able to sort of get ahead of some of that process, but hopefully that gives a flavor of some of the areas that we are most focused on, and again, just really want to underscore the degree to which we fully agree on the importance of our engagement in this space in the Indo-Pacific region.
Thanks so much, Laura. We'll look ahead eagerly to those announcements as they come out. There's a question from the chat, and that is, what concrete steps has the administration taken to reinforce American influence and representation at international forums under the auspices of the UN as well as others? And I'm understanding this to mean as part of our strategic competition with China. Over to you.
Absolutely. Well, we see the PRC working in a number of ways to increase its own influence in these institutions, including through representation, as noted in the question, including through the addition of language in certain documents, and of course, in advancing some of its own agenda items in these meetings. You know, we've taken a number of steps, in particular, to both rejoin some of these institutions. As I mentioned in my remarks, the WHO and Human Rights Council are examples where we've really sought to restore our leadership there. You can't really be competing in these spaces if you aren't present, and so that's been sort of step number one. And we are working with our allies and partners to find ways to increase, you know, support for candidates for a number of positions across international institutions in the UN system, and frankly, as I mentioned earlier, to ensure that we are actually putting forward our own affirmative vision in you know, in these areas to make sure that we are helping to write the rules and shape the norms, even while pushing back on some of the pieces of norm setting that we see China seeking to advance. So I think, you know, this past year has been one for us of taking steps to reconstitute and renew our leadership, and I think we're looking forward to taking additional steps in the years ahead.
Thanks, Laura. A follow-up from former Undersecretary of State Bob Hormats on the economic framework question. We had common goals in TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership. Are we reconsidering joining or working with other TPP members based on the principles of the original TPP arrangement?
Hi, Bob. Thanks so much for the question. Sorry, I can't see you there, but great to hear from you. You know, I'm not in. You know, I don't have anything sort of new to articulate in terms of you know, our well-known position on TPP. But obviously, you know, the conversations we're having with countries in the region does include countries that are part of that framework. And again, I'm not going to be able to preview anything further in terms of what the contents of those conversations have been. But obviously, we're certainly looking to make sure that these are consistent with the kinds of principles and interests and values that are, you know, in service both of, again, a sort of free and open region, but also of protecting American workers and American families, and that, you know, for this administration is a really important piece of it. So nothing more specific really to add on that point.
Laura, we've talked a lot about the U.S. perspectives, the Biden administration approach, the 5 principles you laid out so helpfully. Let's flip the aperture a bit and think about China and how you are thinking about China in this very consequential year for the PRC, with the run-up, starting with the Olympics in a few weeks. You talked about that, but then really the run-up to the 20th Party Congress in the fall. How is that consequential year for China shaping or informing your own decision-making on policy direction?
Well, it's a great question, and you know, it's certainly a consequential year for China. I would say that from our perspective, you know, it's a consequential year, as frankly every year is consequential at the moment, to positioning the United States to outcompete China. And you know, I think that my colleagues and I all feel, you know, a sense of general, you know, urgency in making sure that we put the United States in the best position to be able to compete, you know, not just based on Beijing's calendar, but based on, you know, our own view of needing to make sure that we, as I said, renew our sources of strength and align with our allies and partners, and put ourselves on a really strong footing. Certainly, you know, we all know how these calendar events can affect Beijing's own calculus. I think we're most focused, frankly, on identifying the opportunities for us to make the most progress and being able to sort of move the ball forward. And different windows of time provide different opportunities there, and that's kind of how we're certainly thinking about it. We're also, of course, watching very closely the developments as we head up to the Party Congress. It will be a very busy year, and I think we're going to be continuing to sort of keep an eye on all that and factor it into our thinking. But I think from my perspective, we're driving an agenda forward and just constantly looking to identify the best opportunities to advance those goals.
Well, one last question, Laura, as you have a hard stop at 2:30, and thanks again for being with us today. The question is about how critical is India to the broader American strategy in competing with China? How far is the U.S. willing to go to support India in its own conflict with China, because India is already bearing the brunt of direct Chinese military aggression?
Well, thanks. I mean, obviously, we've taken a number of steps this year to deepen our partnership with India, and they're a key member of the Quad, which, I think having met twice at the leader level, first time to meet at the leader level and to do so twice, once virtually and once in person, really underscores the importance of that format. And then, of course, India's role in that is quite critical. And I think you're right to point to the fact that Beijing has obviously been, engaging in provocations along, India's border, just as we also see it in many cases testing, gray zone activities throughout other parts of the region. But we, have had very good conversations with India about a range of issues. I think we, see India as a really important partner, not just, by the way, in terms of sort of pushing back on China, but frankly, if you look at the agenda, for instance, that's come out of the Quad, and the ways we're working with India on everything from vaccines to technology, and more broadly, there's a lot of things that we are doing in an affirmative way that I think really does underscore the importance of that partnership, of the role that India can play in this, in addition to, again, the sort of direct pushback, but really helping in partnership with others to really advance a very different vision for the Indo-Pacific.
Well, Laura, thanks so much for your time, for your keynote remarks, and taking our audience questions today. Your leadership on these issues is so impactful for U.S. policy towards China, and we at NBR look forward to continuing to be a resource for you and your staff. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much to all of you, and enjoy the rest of the conversation here today. And again, look forward to reading the latest volume of Strategic Asia. Always such a resource. So take care. Thank you.
I'm now pleased to turn the mic over to Alison Szalwinski, NBR Vice President for Research, herself a co-editor of 5 volumes in the Strategic Asia series. She'll moderate a discussion with several of this year's authors, including our distinguished Strategic Asia Research Director and Editor, Ashley Tellis. Allie, the virtual floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Roy. It's my distinguished pleasure, as Roy noted, to introduce and turn it over to several of the contributors for this year's volume. So we'll hear from Research Director Ashley Tellis on some of the overarching themes of the volume this year, as well as his overview chapter on the United States in particular. And then we'll also hear from the contributors to the Northeast Asia portions of the volume and Oceania. So to introduce our speakers and then really to turn it over to hear from them, Ashley Tellis is a senior fellow and holds the Tata Chair in Strategic Affairs at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Fortunately for us, he's also a counselor for NBR, and he serves as the research director for the Strategic Asia program and has been a co-editor of the program's annual volume since 2004. After we hear from Ashley, we'll turn it over to Dr. Michael J. Green, who is the Senior Vice President for Asia, Japan Chair, and Henry A. Kissinger Chair at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He also serves as Director for Asian Studies at the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown. And as I mentioned, Mike will cover Northeast Asia, including Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea. And then we are so pleased to have with us two of our contributors from the other hemisphere who are joining us bright and early at their time zone. I think they signed on around 5:30 or 6 a.m. their time. We're very pleased that they could be with us here today. So Rebecca Strating is the director of La Trobe Asia and an associate professor in politics and international relations at La Trobe University. Her research focuses on maritime disputes in Asia and Australian foreign and defense policy, to which she has written and co-edited numerous publications. And her co-author on the chapter in this year's volume is Joanne Wallis, who is a professor of international security in the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Adelaide. She's authored and edited 7 books, including Constitution Making During State Building and Pacific Power, Australia's Strategy in the Pacific Islands. So Beck and Joanne will be discussing the Oceania chapter, including Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific Islands. It should be a really great conversation, and we're looking forward to receiving questions from audience members as they come up during the course of these presentations. So with that, I will turn it over to Ashley.
Well, thank you, Ali. Let me start by actually thanking both Michael and you for the wonderful collaboration every year in the production of this series. It's really one of the most interesting things that I do in the calendar year, and to be able to work with great colleagues like the two of you and all the colleagues who contribute to the volume is really just an amazing experience. I mean, for someone like me, who is a broad international relations generalist, I really learn so much by reading and studying the individual contributions. And we've been very lucky this year, as in every year, to have a wonderful set of contributors, 3 of whom are represented today. So thank you very much for that. Let me start by just offering a few remarks about the themes that we tried to investigate in this year's work. Very clearly, the issues of US-China competition had been building up for quite some time before the Trump administration took office. It was part of the evolution of the international political system in recent years. But it certainly received a rather decisive impetus with the Trump administration's decision to clarify the fact that China was in fact a strategic competitor, to affirm that in a series of national security documents, and to pursue a range of policies that were designed to prosecute that competition. So that certainly represented a turning point of what was a slow evolution that the international system had been experiencing for at least 20 years. The second trend, which, as Michael Wills pointed out, was also the very sharp pushback against globalization. Globalization, as we all know, was slowing since the global financial crisis. But with the Trump administration's entry into office, there was a very concerted pushback on globalization, because Trump had a certain vision of US trade relationships and what global trading relationships ought to look like. And so that created ricochet effects throughout the international system, which of course were only amplified because the issues pertaining to the pushback of globalization intersected uncomfortably with the questions of US-China competition. And globalization and the pushback against globalization, in fact, took a specific form with countries attempting to decouple, particularly in certain strategic sectors, from China in an effort to build up resiliency and to mitigate vulnerabilities that might arise from excessive dependence on China. And of course, then there was the third unfortunate reality, which we are still struggling with, which is the COVID-19 pandemic, which, unlike the SARS and the MERS crises of decades past, is truly a global pandemic with no end in sight. And the consequences of this pandemic are likely to be multi-decadal, as previous global pandemics have been. And they will have real implications on the ability of states to generate national power. One question which we asked, but unfortunately cannot answer simply because it's dependent on time, is whether the COVID pandemic will change the structural balances of power in the global system. That is, will some states do so much better than others so as to confound our expectations of how the global system evolves? These are the three big issues that each of the authors in the volume attempted to understand and analyze with respect to either their subregions or their countries. And it is a story of quite remarkable diversity, actually. Some parts of the Asian system have reacted very favorably to the advent of US-China competition because their own interests intersect very meaningfully with those of the United States. Others have been more cautious about the advent of competition and have attempted to actually escape it. The countries of Southeast Asia are a good example. And still others have attempted to exploit the competition between the United States and China in order to advance their own national interest. And that too is a fascinating story. With respect to globalization, you see a similar variation across various national boundaries. And, the volume attempts to understand why and how those variances have emerged. On COVID-19, of course, there is much greater similarity of response, though the impact has varied depending on the extent of the pandemic's effects on public health, the character of the regimes, the durability of governance systems, and of course, key choices made by both leaderships in various countries, as well as decisions made in Washington and China. And I suspect Mike, when he speaks about Northeast Asia, will say something about the way China attempted to exploit, the pandemic through vaccine diplomacy and so on and so forth. So there is considerable variation in national responses to each of these three realities, and the volume attempted to assess that and understand what the long-term impacts on power generation would be. I focused very much on the United States for a very simple reason. Because although most of the changes in the last 2 decades have been occurring outside the US, the last 4 years have seen a remarkable burst of change emerging from within the United States. And because the United States is a hegemonic power, when the US sneezes, the world sometimes catches a cold. And the last 4 years, just testified to that reality, that decisions that were made in Washington with respect to recasting the US role in the world, with respect to renegotiating US alliance commitments, and efforts to repress globalization, all had differential impacts in ways that needed to be understood. And so my chapter focused on those issues in detail. We can talk about them further in the discussion. But I think what the last 4 years showed is that the US is now a fit subject for analysis as well. That is, one simply cannot look at the strategic Asia region and simply imagine that changes will always occur on the outside. Rather, changes that occur within the United States often have consequences that shape the evolution of the international system in very consequential ways, in ways that we simply cannot take for granted as we did in the yesteryears. So let me end on that note and yield the floor back to you.
Great, thanks so much, Ashley. We'll dive right into some thoughts from Mike on Northeast Asia.
Well, thank you, Ali, and thank you, Michael and Ashley, for leading us through this. As you all know, I was recruited to do a chapter for the very first Strategic Asia some 2 decades ago when I was 12 years old. And I got out of it by joining the National Security Council and becoming the senior director for Asia. But when I returned to the academy, NBR made me pay back with compound interest. I've done several chapters now under Ashley's leadership. Really enjoyed it. The multi-layered analysis really tells you a lot more than you usually see in volumes like this, looking at different variables across different countries and regions. And also, what I especially like about the NBR volume is it gives agency in the dynamics of Asia to the Pacific Islands, to Australia, New Zealand, to Japan, Korea, Taiwan. It doesn't just fall into the trap of the US-China bipolar game, which is a huge strategic insight and contribution. For Japan, Korea, Taiwan, of the variables that Michael and Ashley introduced, there's no doubt that the strategic competition with China is the defining variable for how these foreign policies have evolved. Japan already had a strategy of competition, of managed competition with China, well baked in before COVID even struck. Largely consummated under Abe Shinzo, but really drawing on strains of thinking about China that had evolved in previous governments and that go back millennia in Japan. It's telling that in the election last year in Japan, in the leadership race within the ruling LDP party, no candidate except the Communist Party challenged the fundamental direction Japan had taken to align with other powers to maintain a free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. And it mattered a great deal that the terms Japan introduced into this debate, free and open Indo-Pacific, elevating the Quad to a summit, these were all things that Abe had been arguing for, that really, thanks to Xi Jinping, had currency in Delhi and Canberra and Washington. Korea tried to spend 2020 and 2021 avoiding strategic competition. The preferred term in Seoul is strategic ambiguity between the US and China. And I think that has proven untenable. And if you're following the South Korean presidential election and race, you can see that advisors to both candidates are acknowledging that Korea has self-isolated itself by not participating in the shaping strategies towards a rising China. But unresolved, and the election in Korea will be an important determinant of which way that strategy goes. Taiwan is very divided over the future of relations with the mainland. But this last year, the combination of COVID and Hong Kong, in my view, decisively shifted the center of political gravity towards Tsai Ing-wen's view, the president of Taiwan, of protecting de facto independence, but not going for de jure independence, and increasing Chinese coercion against Hong Kong, but also directly against Taiwan has driven this. So geopolitical structural factors, really are the most important variables. But COVID has been an interesting intervening variable in this whole dynamic. Japan and China in the early days of the virus in Wuhan were cooperating. Japanese NGOs and citizens were sending masks and kits, and there was a flurry of hope that Japan-China relations might be moving in a more congenial direction. Didn't happen, and that's largely because of the wolf warrior diplomacy, the righteous indignation, the coercion, frankly, that Beijing demonstrated towards any country, especially Australia, that challenged China's performance or delivery of public goods. And so Japanese public and government views of China deteriorated markedly, even further during COVID. In the last election, no party was urging better relations with China. And perhaps the most vociferously anti-Chinese party of all was the Japanese Communist Party, ironically. Ditto for Taiwan, as I mentioned. COVID definitely affected a deterioration. And in Korea, views of China also sharply deteriorated over the last 2 years, which is why the presidential election in Korea has a somewhat different debate about China and the free and open Indo-Pacific than usual. Now, was that because of COVID? Maybe. Maybe the coercion we saw from Beijing was because of legitimacy crises or legitimacy concerns by Xi Jinping. We'd have to open that black box to figure it out. The last category, deglobalization, the irony perhaps, or the exception, is that Northeast Asia didn't deglobalize. In this period, Japan stepped up, moved from something like 15% of its trade being covered by trade agreements to 85%, leading on CPTPP. There's no rejection of globalization in Japan. And Taiwan and Korea in more incremental ways have moved in the same direction. To the extent there is an economic shift in the last year or two, it's, I would say, realignment of supply chains out of China, tapering, not pulling out completely, but tapering to put more supply chains, and especially high tech, into places like Vietnam and North America. And so that's more of a realignment than a deglobalization, and one which I think the Biden administration can capitalize on if they can get their economic framework together in time. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Mike. And over to you, Beck and Joanne.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm really pleased to have been able to contribute a chapter to this excellent edition with my colleague, Professor Joanne Wallis. We focused on strategic competition in Oceania, and of course, Oceania is quite a diverse region. And we also considered that the key variable over the time period that we're looking at was US-China strategic competition, which has really shaped to varying degrees how these oceanic states have tried to recalibrate their relationships with great powers, while also trying to maintain their relative autonomy in economic, foreign and security policies. So our chapter does touch on COVID-19, which has been an issue for all states across the region, but I'm going to focus my comments on strategic competition and the effect on Australia and New Zealand, and Joanne will talk more about the Pacific Island states. So like a number of states in the region, Australia and New Zealand have traditionally had strong security ties with the United States, coupled with trade reliance on China. So the great power competition between these, between the US and China has exacerbated the tension between economic and security policies. And we argue in our chapter that this has ultimately pushed both states closer to the United States. Australia somewhat more enthusiastically, perhaps than perhaps New Zealand. But just focusing in on Australia for a moment, over the past 5 years, Australia has come to view China as a security competitor. Canberra has long been deeply committed to relations with the United States, and both public and political opinion are almost uniformly in favour of the US alliance. Yet Australia had also adopted what is often referred to as a pragmatic approach to managing great powers, which explicitly avoided choosing between the US and China. Yet concerns about China's actions towards Australia, as well as its international assertions, have made these debates about a China choice all but redundant. In 2018, around APEC, we saw the Morrison government trying to avoid narratives around strategic competition. But over the past 2 years, China's coercive tactics, which Mike mentioned in his discussion, and the so-called wolf warrior diplomacy tactics have been particularly instrumental in shifting Australia closer to the United States. In 2020, a range of tariffs were placed on Australian industries by China: barley, meat, seafood, wine, cotton, just to name a few. And in response, Australia lodged a complaint against China with the World Trade Organization. So I think what we're seeing is it's very difficult for Australia to pursue pragmatic policies when China is acting in the way that it is in terms of economic coercion. And we see this real a defined anti-pragmatism strand emerging in Australia's strategic thought. And Australia has, I guess, long been regarded as the canary in the coal mine concerning China's economic statecraft efforts to create a wedge between the United States and its allies. And I think one of the most important lessons is that that effort appears to be failing. And while in 2021, bilateral relations between Australia and China were calmer, I guess, than what they were in 2020, there's still this freeze on high-level diplomatic talks, and there doesn't appear to be a softening on either side. And Australia has also joined the United States in a diplomatic boycott of the Olympics. But there are two lessons that also emerged in terms of Australia's economic situation and China's statecraft. The first being that the punishment wasn't as bad as what it seemed, despite this, this wide ranging tariffs that were applied. Core industries, iron ore in particular, were not touched. And so the damage to Australia's economy was not as significant as what it might have been. And it also compelled Australia to really think seriously about diversifying and its own sort of economic resilience, and thinking about how to reduce reliance upon one country when it comes to economic policy. But possibly the most significant announcement in 2021, which unfortunately came while Joanne and I were doing the final proofing of this chapter, was AUKUS, the security trilateral partnership between Australia, UK and the United States. And the UK's officials are currently in Australia for AUKMIN, talking about what they might do as part of this new agreement between these three states. So we didn't get a chance to write a whole lot about that in the chapter, but there's a few points that I'd like to make here about that. The first is that this demonstrates from an Australian perspective that it wants a really expanded role in the region, and that it is keen to participate in this kind of US-led integrated deterrence. The second point I would make is that the announcement of the AUKUS security partnership indicates that Canberra, for all intents and purposes, has chosen the United States. It's sort of consolidated that trend over the last few years of moving closer towards Washington. While there were initially concerns about US commitment to the region and reliability following the election of President Trump in 2016, there's been no apparent lasting damage. If anything, AUKUS suggests that Australia has been rewarded for being a relatively trouble-free, steadfast and dependable ally. There's a few other points I would like to make about Australia, but I'm running out of time, and I want to cover New Zealand because, in contrast, New Zealand has historically sought to maintain greater autonomy in foreign and defence policy, and this approach appears to be shifting as well. New Zealand has slightly more wriggle room than Australia because it doesn't exist within that formal US security guarantee. And some of the rhetoric in New Zealand can be quite mixed about the US and about China, and a kind of avoidance of strategic competition. But I think we argue that there is this reluctant move towards Washington that we can see in terms of greater security and defence cooperation. And while New Zealand might not be as outwardly critical of China as Australia, the government of Jacinda Ardern has promised that her government will stand up for New Zealand values internationally, and it has been willing to call out Beijing's actions perhaps more than what previous governments have been. So as with any state, understanding New Zealand's approach requires looking beyond what leaders say to their domestic audiences. And over the past decade, our chapter tracks this movement towards bilateral and multilateral exercises, which have increased since the 2010 Wellington Declaration. So we see that New Zealand will likely support the United States in practice so long as New Zealand relies on a US-led regional order. So just to conclude my remarks before handing it over to Joanne, one of the crucial areas for Australia and New Zealand is climate change. The US and New Zealand are committed to addressing climate change, whereas Australia has been a laggard on this, and this might have implications for Australia and the US relationship. But as maritime democracies, both Australia and New Zealand have important roles to play in the US goals of developing a networked security architecture across the Indo-Pacific. Thank you.
Thanks, Beck. So as Beck said, I'm picking up and talking primarily about the Pacific Islands, and which we also covered in our chapter. So as we discuss in our chapter, Australia and the US perceive that the Pacific Island states and territories play a critical role in helping to preserve a free and open Indo-Pacific, as they're vital to maintaining sea lines of communication and providing a strategic buffer and route for power projection. Since 2018, Australia has been engaged in a substantial step up to enhance our development, security, diplomatic and people-to-people links in the Pacific Islands, and the US has similarly made a pledge to focus more on the region. Australia's step up and the US's pledge have been driven in large part by a perception that China's growing presence in the region, including through its BRI, generates influence for China and may in turn lead to interference or coercion. While China had built its diplomatic and economic presence in the Pacific since the 1970s as part of its diplomatic competition with Taiwan, concern about China's presence in the Pacific has escalated over the last 4 years, particularly after April 2018 reports that China was in talks to build a military base in Vanuatu, and then Solomon Islands and Kiribati decided to switch their diplomatic recognition to China in 2019. But there are two dangers of Australia and the US focusing their Pacific policies primarily on countering China. The first is their assumption that China's presence necessarily generates influence. While rumours of potential defence alignments frequently follow announcements that Pacific Island states have signed on for the BRI or have switched their diplomatic recognition, nothing substantive has yet materialised. And this is not to say that China is not attempting coercion in the region, but rather that it has not yet had substantive effects. In fact, several Micronesian states have sought to expand their defence relationships with the US, with Palau and Federated States of Micronesia offering to host new US bases. So in many ways, the coercion has backfired on China. Several Melanesian states have enhanced their security relationships with Australia. We signed a security treaty with the Solomon Islands in 2017, a Vuvale or friendship partnership with Fiji in 2019, and a comprehensive strategic and economic partnership with Papua New Guinea in 2020. And we're also negotiating a bilateral security treaty with Vanuatu. After this week's volcanic eruption and tsunami in Tonga, it has been Australia and New Zealand to which Tonga first looked and which have led the response. The second danger of focusing primarily on countering China is that Australia and the US might alienate some Pacific Island states. Several Pacific leaders have made clear their concern about being drawn into strategic competition. This is particularly in the Southern Pacific. Instead, they emphasise non-traditional security interests. And COVID-19 is the most acute security challenge facing the Pacific Islands, and climate change is the most serious existential one. And the pandemic has revealed that while Pacific Island peoples are resilient and able to respond and adapt to challenges, there are limits to that resilience when so many of these challenges are exogenous. So what should Australia and the US do? Well, Australia in particular already does a lot, but we need to better recognise the risks of engagement that is perceived to be primarily intended to advance our geopolitical aims. And the announcement in October last year that Australia will fund Telstra, which is our national telco, to buy Digicel, the telco in the Pacific, to head off its purchase by Huawei is an example of the latter. We need to be careful that our responses don't create or fuel divisions within the region. The decisions of Solomon Islands and Kiribati to switch their diplomatic recognition have been controversial domestically. In Solomon Islands, what's known as the switch has intersected with hardening secessionist movement in its Malaita province and competition to access commercial properties, as well as long-term historical grievances. Taiwan has reportedly donated aid directly to the Malaita provincial government. And then the US became involved in October 2020, announcing that it was giving aid directly to Malaita. And this has fed into already combustible domestic tensions in Solomon Islands, and we saw these play out in the riots in Honiara late last year. We can look for more ways to mitigate the effects of the worst exogenous shocks that the region will face. A current example is Australia's work helping Pacific Island states to map and settle their maritime borders in anticipation of them being altered by rising sea levels. As states that claim to support the international rules-based order, Australia and the US can play an important role as international advocates for the Pacific on this and other issues. This is, of course, not to say that Pacific Island states can't advocate for themselves internationally. We saw Pacific representatives doing just that at COP26 last year, and of course they have a long history of doing so. Australia and the US could also do more to provide platforms for Pacific states to engage internationally with respect to the changing geopolitics of the region and the broader Indo-Pacific. There's currently no regional mechanism akin to the ASEAN Regional Forum, where Pacific Island states could collectively engage in dialogue with external powers about security and geopolitical issues. While the existing post-Pacific Islands Forum dialogue might fulfill this role, with the possibility that the 5 Micronesian members of the forum may follow through on their stated intention to leave the forum, Australia and the US could support Pacific Island states to create an alternative platform for these discussions. There's also scope for Track 1.5 dialogues with Pacific officials and scholars, and this would represent a tangible way to demonstrate that we see Pacific Island states as our equal partners. Australia and the US also need to engage in more frank public conversations about what consequences might flow for the Pacific Islands from our strategic manoeuvring. For example, while Prime Minister Morrison has sought to reassure Pacific leaders that the AUKUS partnership will enhance, rather than diminish, Australia's ability to play a positive role in securing the region, there is understandable scepticism about this in the Pacific, a lot of that linked to concerns about nuclear issues. This is a little bit tangential to our chapter, but I'm currently leading an Australian Defence Strategic Policy grant that is analysing security cooperation in the Pacific Islands. And our research has mapped and found that there is no overarching security architecture. Security cooperation can best be characterised as a patchwork of state, bilateral and multilateral agreements, arrangements and institutions. Now, the resource constraints that Pacific states face mean that they often rely on partner support. But our mapping has raised questions about how well targeted that support is and the capacity of Pacific Island states to absorb it. As Australia and the US seek to increase their activity in the Pacific Islands, there is a vital need to better coordinate our assistance. And this suggests that there is scope for more cooperative projects that address regional priorities. And the Papua New Guinea Electrification Partnership between Australia, New Zealand, Japan and the US that was announced at APEC in 2018 is a good example of this. So to conclude, and as Beck and I argue in our chapter, Australia and the US will have the most success advancing our regional relationships and consequently our strategic priorities if we don't take fright at every announcement of a Chinese initiative in the Pacific Islands. Instead, we need to demonstrate that we are partners who are committed over the long term and who genuinely listen to Pacific Island states and work together to support their interests. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Joanne. So we're already getting a few great questions from folks. If anyone has questions, please send them to events@nbr.org. And we'll try to get to as many of these before our time is up here today. So to kind of kick off a little bit of the discussion, I will take the moderator's prerogative to say, when we look at the trajectory of the US competition with China, recently many have welcomed the US withdrawal from Afghanistan as a potential opportunity for the United States to finally fully shift its focus to the Indo-Pacific and to that strategic competition with China. So my question first for Ashley, and then if our other panelists have some inputs from perspectives from the region, is we've heard some recent reports that Russia may credibly be planning an invasion of Ukraine, which would certainly cause the United States to have to respond while simultaneously continuing to focus on the Indo-Pacific and the competition with China. So if this does unfold, how would this development impact the US's ability to execute a coherent strategy of competition? And for our Mike and Beck and Joanne, how might such a situation, such a development impact the views of those in the region on US commitment, US reliability? So first we'll turn to Ashley and then we'll allow others to respond.
Ali, this is a question that was probably better directed to Laura, because this is a challenge that the administration is going to face in very short order. But I think the question points to a larger issue, which is whatever US preferences may be with respect to the character of its engagement with the world gets a vote. There will be things that happen which require the United States to respond, and to respond in a way that protects its interests while still maintaining its priorities. Given that fact, it worries me actually that many Biden administration officials privately make the argument that we are currently focused right now on domestic restructuring and domestic regeneration. And once that process is complete, we will be able to take a more active and energetic role in world affairs. This is the analog to the Russia problem in a different way. And the answer to both challenges is the same, which is the world doesn't wait around for you. And so I think we will have to come up with a strategy that allows us to maintain our focus on what our national security priorities are, even as we deal with a variety of other challenges that will appear, challenges that we may not have anticipated.
Ashley. Back, Joanne, from the region.
I mean, just briefly from the Pacific perspective, I think there was questions raised by the nature of the withdrawal from Afghanistan. It was very chaotic. It didn't necessarily instill a huge amount of confidence. And I think this issue of reliability is a long-term concern in the Pacific, because the Pacific is very used to their interest in them ebbing and flowing depending on the geopolitical tides. And that's why, we emphasize in our chapter, there needs to be continuity. There needs to be a sense that the commitment is genuine, because a lot of Pacific leaders are being made to feel that they will be forced eventually to make, that they're going to be forced eventually to make a choice. And I think we need to reassure them that if they choose us, it will be a reliable long-term commitment from us. We won't cut and run. So I think that it did raise some questions, although it freed up resources. At the same time, the manner in which it was conducted did raise questions for states that are making very consequential decisions potentially about their futures.
If I may just add to that, I think issues around US commitment, credibility and leadership in the Indo-Pacific region are ones that, they're kind of consistent with how regional states think about their own security and their own position. And in Australia, I think we saw that even though there were lots of questions raised about US commitment, particularly during the presidency of Donald Trump, because of the kind of America First narratives that were coming out, because of the the discussions around alliance free riding and those sorts of issues, that while there were discussions in Australia about our strategic dependence on the US, that ultimately it had very little effect on Australia's security policy. So we talked about it, well, some of us worried about it, but ultimately Australia has decided that it wants to anchor the US in the Indo-Pacific region. It wants to sort of coordinate and cooperate with the US in a way that encourages US continuing presence and leadership in the region. The other
Looks like Beck froze. Give her a second to come back here. While we see if she can reconnect, Mike, we'll hand it over to you.
Sure. Well, picking up on Beck's last point, it's interesting. Oh, sorry, here she is.
Sorry, Beck, you froze there for maybe a minute and a half, maybe not even.
Oh, I'm sorry. Shall I go back to just making the point that Australia is firmly committed to US leadership in the region, and that's really what it's pursuing through its activities. But on the Afghanistan withdrawal, I think there are two strands of the debate. One is that it kind of abandoned Afghanistan, and there's a question around the nature of the withdrawal, as Joanne said. But I think I'm much more in the camp of that Australian sort of policymakers and analysts would see this as being a reflection of the US tilting towards the Indo-Pacific, and that this is a sign that perhaps the Biden administration will be operationalizing this commitment that it has expressed to the Indo-Pacific region. And the third point I would make is that on sort of other security issues that you raised was that Australia has a long history of engagement in US-led operations. And these are, big, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, or also a bit smaller. Recently, the Strait of Hormuz, Australia was there alongside the US. So I'm sure that sort of historical trend will factor into any of Australia's decision-making in the future.
I mean, the other point to pick up on that is that, we don't give enough credit to Canberra or Tokyo and other close allies in terms of their ability to shape American policy. We talk all the time about shaping China's choices. The fact is, during the Trump years, the Abe Morrison governments did an incredibly effective job reinforcing the good ideas and blunting the bad ideas, and really shaping American strategy. The free and open Indo-Pacific strategy itself was Abe's idea, and Trump, his team borrowed it, lock, stock, and barrel, started using it. So pretty effective shaping of the strategic environment through the US, which is indispensable for allies and partners on the front lines. And I think it's for that reason that right now in Tokyo or Canberra and Taipei, probably in Seoul, maybe in Delhi, this possibility, some would say probability, of a Russian attack on Ukraine is very worrisome. On the one hand, these countries on the front line in the Indo-Pacific cannot abide the example of successful coercion and invasion of a historic territorial dispute. Just think of Taiwan, think of the South China Sea, think of the Himalayan mountains. It's an absolutely unacceptable precedent to allow. On the other hand, none of these allies and partners want the US to shift resources back to NATO. And so this is a huge challenge for the administration strategy. I don't think Laura would have been in a position to really answer it. I think the answer is we can't choose which regions we focus on. We have to we're a global power. And at the same time, while the administration did well in the first year with AUKUS, with the Quad, with the Free and Open Indo-Pacific strategy, the Lowy Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, Pew, so many surveys show that in the region, people think the US has restored its diplomatic influence. But the same surveys generally show a pronounced loss of American economic influence in the first year of the Biden administration. It's very clear in the ICS poll and the Lowy Power Survey. And many surveys also suggest a continued deterioration of the American military advantage. So, the administration doesn't have the latitude or the option of sort of rebuilding at home first. They've got to move out. And if they don't move from the sort of inchoate, sort of vague Indo-Pacific economic framework into actionable concrete steps at rulemaking, they're going to have a big problem in 2022 as China pushes to join CPTPP. If they don't step up defense spending and prioritize in the Pentagon the systems, the weapons they need to prevail against an increasingly capable PLA, then they're going to fall further behind. So they had a good first year, the Biden administration, but mostly in what scholars call external balancing and aligning and partnerships. Now they're going to have to put some real skin in the game on trade and on deterrence. And the Ukraine case just makes it all the more so, not less so, I'd say. So I'm sure the people working on Asia and the administration would completely agree with this. They got to compete against other priorities the president has and make their case.
Great, thanks. So I want to make sure we get to some of these questions. We'll try to get to at least 2 or 3 here in the time remaining to us. The first I have is for Ashley. from Professor Amit Ahuja from UC Santa Barbara. And he asks, as the US-China strategic competition turns more belligerent, how should we think about the role of ideology? What is the core idea or set of ideas, ones we are willing to defend, that distinguish us from our rival? And are these shared by our partners in Asia? Or is ideology not relevant to this rivalry?
I think ideology is relevant and irrelevant, or should be irrelevant at the same time. And let me explain what I mean by that. The best form of ideological competition is to protect, preserve our own democracy and our own liberal order at home, and to strengthen the liberal order as an attractive alternative to the authoritarian alternatives that are propagated by China. That kind of ideological competition, I think we should be engaged in, and we should be engaged in actively, showing by force of our example, showing by our demonstrative capability that democracy is, in fact, the best normative order for governance. But the kind of ideological competition that I hope we will avoid is attempting to compete with China by making the character of Chinese domestic politics, in particular, the CCP and the character of the CCP, the target of competition. I think if you get into that kind of an ideological rivalry, you will tend to lose many partners in Asia who, no matter how much they dislike the Communist Party, are not seeking to be part of a strategy of regime change in China. They prefer that those are choices best left to the Chinese people. And what we ought to be doing is focusing our attention on the pernicious consequences of what ideology may bring on the outside. That is how it affects our interests, how it affects our politics. That, I think, is an acceptable and desirable form of ideological competition. But any ideological competition that moves us further into provoking and messing around in Chinese domestic politics, I would, at least as a personal matter, be cautious about.
Thanks, Ashley. A question for Mike regarding Japan and South Korea's threat perceptions of China. Are we seeing more divergence or convergence? Do you expect this trend to continue, reverse, or accelerate? And if there is a trend of convergence, should we expect modest movement towards greater US ROK coordination, or even US-Japan ROK coordination on China policy?
So I think the trend lines are somewhat favorable in terms of improved coordination among U.S., Japan, and Republic of Korea. Last week, there was a senior level trilateral meeting. The series of missile tests we've seen from North Korea is forcing that. Whenever North Korea misbehaves, it tends to drive trilateral U.S., Japan, Korea cooperation. So North Korea is helping. China's helping, frankly. As I said, public opinion about China in Korea has deteriorated markedly over the last 2 years. Japan and Korea already align very closely. We've shown this in surveys at CSIS we've done, already aligned very closely on their views of the importance of U.S. leadership, the importance of U.S. alliances, maintaining an open regional order. The missing link is actually agreeing they should cooperate with each other to do something about that. And my dogs fully agree with that as well. And so that's the missing piece. With an election in Korea, there's a new cabinet coming in office. There may be an opportunity to jumpstart, but this won't be transformational change. It'll be incremental improvements in cooperation, and absolutely critical for the U.S. Strategy to have these allies work together.
Great. I have another question for Mike, and then perhaps we can also kind of pivot it to that Beck and Joanne can give it a little thought on Taiwan. the question asks, do you think Japan will have more clarity to defend Taiwan with the United States in case of a Taiwan contingency? So I guess I would just ask for you to think a little bit about how Japan is currently thinking about Taiwan, working with the United States to shore up its relationship with Taiwan, and then for Beck and Joanne, from Australia's perspective, for Beck, and for Joanne, the Pacific Islands, where in some of those islands, Taiwan still has a pretty strong relationship and an important role. How has China's, over the past year, really over the past several years, increasing aggression and sort of behavior around Taiwan impacted what Australia and the Pacific Islands are thinking about when it comes to cross-strait relations and their relationship with Taiwan?
Why don't you start with the Australian view so I can go let my son in and stop my dogs from barking?
That sounds great. All right.
Happy to take that question. Look, it's been an interesting year in Australia in terms of debates about Taiwan and what Australia's role would be if conflict were to break out, particularly between US, China, Taiwan. And, you know, it's contributed to this increasing rhetoric in Australia that was probably best exemplified by an Australian official talking about the beating drums of war, and this sense that Taiwan as a flashpoint is forcing Australia to grapple with this rapidly changing region that is deteriorating in terms of a number of sort of key security measures. And Taiwan, in terms of the Australia choice, or the China choice, sorry, that I was talking about in my comments earlier about, you know, Australia having to choose between the US and China, Taiwan has been the kind of central part of that choice. What would Australia do if the US and China were to come to blows over Taiwan? And increasingly, we see Australia shifting away from a position of strategic ambiguity, and leaders, particularly Defence Minister Peter Dutton, trending us in a direction that says that we are with the US on this question. So I'll leave it there.
Yeah, having silenced my dogs, I would say, speaking personally, I have very high confidence that in the event of Chinese use of force against Taiwan, both Japan and Australia would play a significant role. I would expect that it would be a role that directly connects to the immediate interests of both countries. With Australia, that would be securing the southern flank, South China Sea, and so forth, because of the consequences of a PLA expansion. When I worked in the Pentagon in the late 90s, the Taiwan scenarios were all very narrow and linear and across the strait. China's warfighting strategy is now to basically go at the entire first and second island chains. That puts them in Australia's backyard. So an Australian role could be arguably defensive, and ditto for Japan. The Chinese scenarios for Taiwan, unless it's cyber or something like that, if it's a coercive military move or attack, it's almost impossible for the Chinese to execute that the way they've been exercising and preparing without pulling Japan in. And I think for at least 10 or 15 years, the Chinese have probably assumed that Japan is in any Taiwan scenario that escalates. What's new is that the Japanese now are talking about this, like Australia, publicly. 75% of Japanese in polls say Japan should play a role. That's higher than Americans, because it's almost existential if China successfully coerced such a close neighbor to Taiwan in the first island chain. Now, all that said, and notwithstanding the reports that there's bilateral planning with Japan now, the bureaucratic and budgetary and other obstacles to effectively cooperating on this are still quite considerable, and there's a lot of homework to be done.
Joanne?
We're already seeing conflict in the Pacific about Taiwan. We saw that in Honiara at the end of last year. And I guess my overriding message is I think that we've got to be really, Taiwan in particular has to be careful, but also Australia and the US have to be careful about the unintended consequences of that the Taiwan-China competition, because it is really felt in the Pacific very immediately, as I said, in Honiara at the end of last year, but also in Honiara in 2006, the riots that destroyed a lot of Chinatown and on Honiara and a lot of downtown Honiara was in part fueled by that Taiwan-China diplomatic competition, and the sense that they were attempting to corrupt different officials. So it's, this just adds to that sense that the Pacific is kind of being dragged into situations or competition that they would rather be out of. But my message, I mean, and I've said this to Taiwanese officials, is you need to be careful of the unintended consequences about what you're doing now. And I mentioned, and Beck and I talk about in our chapter, the fact that Taiwan has given aid directly to Malaita province in Solomon Islands. Now, there's a lot more going on in Solomon Islands than just Taiwan-China competition. A lot of the issues that generated the riots are very long-standing, to do with decolonization and frustrated attempts at federalism. But it is a factor, and it can exacerbate these underlying concerns. So, we're already seeing conflict in the Pacific as a result of this now.
Great, thanks so much. So with that, we are just about at time, and I want to extend our sincere thanks to all of our contributors to the volume, our presenters here today, for your fantastic comments, remarks, responses to the questions, and for your contributions to the volume. And I also want to thank all of the audience members for joining us here today, and perhaps most importantly, extend a thanks to all of the MBR staff that worked to put together this event, as well as tirelessly worked on the volume itself over the past year. This process of putting together the Strategic Asia volume is quite condensed. It's quite fast. We put together a whole edited volume within less than a year's time frame, and there are so many staff and folks that really are critical to making that possible, making that happen. So want to thank them at this time as well. So with that, I hope everybody has a wonderful rest of their day here in the United States and beginning of their day out there in Australia.
Thank you, Ali. Congrats on the volume.
Thanks.